Melody Time is one of Disney's lesser-known set of package films released in the 1940s, which are largely made up of several animated shorts. This one in particular focuses on shorts set to music, much like Fantasia, except with a focus on popular music rather than classical. As with most films made up of a series of shorts, there's a wide variety of quality here. There are a few gems and a lot more mediocre pieces. I think pushing toward a more narrative focus for a lot of these is actually a mistake, as the best bits, Bumble Boogie, Once Upon a Wintertime, and Rhythm of the Samba, are the ones that play out with the fewest words describing the plot. The Johnny Appleseed and Little Toots segments seem endless, and Pecos Bill is also exceptionally long, though the final few minutes make it worth the wait. There's a reason this doesn't endure the way Disney's single-story features have, or even Fantasia, which allowed the music to really drive the show. It's a mixed bag for sure, and I'd really only recommend it for die-hard Disney fans. Secret Admirer tells the story of a teenager who gets an anonymous love note. We know pretty quickly that it's his best female friend who wrote it, but he thinks it was the hottest girl in school, and he starts pursuing her. More letters get written, and then they fall into the hands of people they weren't meant for, and hijinks ensue. Or at least that's the intention of the film. But this is a spectacularly unfunny comedy and unromantic romance, basically hitting none of its marks at all. I attribute that largely to the characters being obnoxious. About half the mistaken identity comedy depends heavily on married couples being ready at the drop of a hat to cheat on their partners, and then it's okay because the love letters weren't for them in the first place. What a great happy ending. The only person I can really empathize with is the girl writing the love letters in the first place, and mostly I just think she deserves way better than the goofball protagonist she likes. It's just a messy, sloppy, ugly film trying to be something lighter and sillier, but there's not much to get out of this. Silk Stockings is a musical version of the 1939 film Ninotchka. It tells the story of a woman from communist Russia sent to retrieve some possible Russian dissidents from Paris, but when she gets there, she is seduced by a man in a world she's never known. It's been a while since I watched the original Ninotchka, but I remember finding it irresistibly charming despite a silly premise. Silk Stockings isn't. I don't know if it's the script, or the fact that I personally have a very difficult time finding Fred Astaire likable, or more likely some combination of both, but mostly I just found myself wanting to go rewatch Ninotchka instead. Most upsetting is how the couple breaks up due to a fairly serious disagreement that then just doesn't exist at the end. And since I wasn't swept away by the couple's chemistry to begin with, I found it even more difficult to care about them steamrolling over the reasons they shouldn't get together. The songs are okay, though they definitely fall into the Cole Porter trap of being too long and too repetitive, and there are some good dance numbers, but this is disappointing overall. Sweet Bird of Youth is a film version of a Tennessee Williams play about a wannabe actor who returns to his hometown accompanied by an aging Hollywood actress. He's come back to get the woman he's in love with, but her family won't let him see her and won't tell him why. The film version has Paul Newman and Geraldine Page reprise their Broadway roles as the young actor and older actress, and they are both fantastic in it. Like so many of Williams' characters, these two are trapped and suffocating under society's expectations of them, and trying to rise above those expectations just seems to result in disaster. I just read the original play and was a little startled to see the film tack on an unexpected happy ending, which definitely doesn't serve the story as well as the original darker ending. But again, like much of Williams' work, this story rises and falls on the strength of the actors, and I could watch Newman and Page play off each other all day. They bring so much more to these roles than meets the eye, and just when I think I've gotten them figured out, they reveal another side of the character. They make this worth the watch for sure. Fun and Fancy Free is one of Disney's package films from the 1940s. This one focuses on two short stories, Bongo the Circus Bear, who runs away to live in the forest, and Mickey and the Beanstalk. There's also two mini segments with Jiminy Cricket and Edgar Bergen that serve as framing devices for the two main segments. While the Mickey and the Beanstalk segment of this is pretty delightful, and those Beanstalk animations are really gorgeous, the Bongo segment is interminable, definitely not worth the time it spends on it. The Bergen live-action ventriloquism section is especially grating to watch, with the kinds of cheesy jokes and eye-rolling catchphrases that make this seem like an after-school special instead of an artistic film for kids. And has the art of ventriloquism come a long way since the 40s, or was Bergen just kind of bad at it? I don't know enough to make an accurate judgment call. It's not a surprise to me at all that the Beanstalk segment is the one that still gets referenced. It's got that great combination of silly jokes, good music, and really lovely animation that stands out in the best Disney films. But as a whole, this is a mixed bag. The Black Cauldron is a Disney film based on the first 2 books of Lloyd Alexander's Prydain Chronicles. It tells the story of Taran, the assistant pig keeper, whose pig turns out to be magical and sought after by the evil Horned King. As he tries to protect her from being captured, he meets a variety of characters who help him out. I'm a big fan of the original book series and tried to approach this without doing too many comparisons, but wow, this is lackluster compared to its source material. Most notably, the incredibly truncated 79-minute runtime omits virtually any character development, which is what made the series stand out for me as a kid. Some characters have entire character arcs just erased, leaving me wondering what purpose these characters serve in the film narrative at all. And because of this, the dramatic moments don't land well. I actually laughed out loud at one character's death because it was handled so abruptly. The Horned King is properly terrifying, so that's a plus, and I do think the concept still works, but it is exceptionally tropey, and the film makes no effort to bring characters out of tropedom and into being fleshed out in any way. Very disappointing. The Guard is an Irish dark crime comedy starring Brendan Gleeson as a curmudgeonly police officer who teams up with an American FBI agent, played by Don Cheadle, to find a group of murderous international drug dealers. Gleeson isn't an easy police officer to work with, but it becomes clear he might be one of the few with integrity in the town. Writer-director John Michael McDonough is the brother of writer Martin McDonough, and you can see definite similarities in their subject matter and sense of humor, although John's humor in The Guard is much less obvious than some of Martin's work. This film works best when it latches onto that humor, and I think it's least successful when it follows obvious crime tropes. Gleeson's character isn't a likable protagonist per se, but watching him push his way past a corrupt system is often satisfying. There's also a very clever bite to the dialogue, which yields some really amusing scenes between Gleeson and the people around him. Take away that sense of humor, and the characters are familiar, the beats are familiar, the stakes are familiar. There's enough to hold my interest, and fans of the crime genre are likely to appreciate it even more, but it does hit its limit for me. Toy Story 4 follows up the concluded Toy Story trilogy with a story about Woody struggling to adjust to his life with a new kid. He goes out of his way to make sure she's taken care of as she enters kindergarten, and it ends with him lost in the outside world again, trying to make everything right. The problem inherent with this movie is that Toy Story has concluded multiple times, with each film drawing the world to a definite close, and the ending of Toy Story 3 was such a deliberate farewell to the series that it's really hard for me to care about the story at all anymore. The story has already concluded. This is why I mostly have sworn off franchises lately. I only watched this for a very specific project for which I needed to complete the series. It's not a bad movie, it's just a non-entity. It's so busy cramming the movie with new characters that it woefully underutilizes the rich cast of characters it already has, which is a problem the series has had before, but really works against it here. My overwhelming takeaway is they decided they had to continue the series and undermine the finality of Toy Story 3 for this? Raya and the Last Dragon tells the story of a young girl who sets out to find, well, the last dragon. The dragon once protected Raya's land from being attacked by ethereal creatures who turn the living to stone, and now, 500 years later, the land has been splintered into multiple warring factions and the evil creatures have returned. Raya hopes finding the dragon will help her repair her land and save her family. I love that this story makes the primary protagonist, antagonist, and sidekick all female. That hardly ever happens on film, and that was a delight to see here. I also really enjoyed the main lesson of trust and the variety of side characters we get throughout the story. Sisu as a character took me a while to get on board with. She falls into my least favorite brand of Disney sidekicks, the wisecracking goofball full of cultural anachronisms that take me out of the story, but they eventually integrate her nicely with the story, and I really enjoyed her by the end. The designs of these characters and worlds are a fascinating mix of Asian-inspired legend and post-apocalyptic Mad Max steampunk. Overall, a familiar plot with some unique takes on character and design. Judas and the Black Messiah is based on the real-life story of Fred Hampton, a prominent leader in Chicago's Black Panther Party, and Bill O'Neill, the Panthers' security chief who was really an FBI informant. The film follows Hampton and O'Neill over the course of roughly a year in the 1960s as they work to change their city. There's a lot of food for thought in this one. Lakeith Stanfield is perfectly cast as O'Neill and brings to the table an improbable combination of languid and restless energy, and Daniel Kaluuya seems unshakable as the party's young chairman, though the real Fred Hampton was only 21 during the events of this film, while Kaluuya is a decade older. O'Neill is such a fascinating character, especially as he becomes more and more interested in the philosophies Hampton is espousing, but finds himself unable to escape his role as informant, and has to continually justify it to himself again and again. There's also a great subplot with Hampton and his pregnant girlfriend struggling with the morality of devoting yourself to a cause at the expense of your life when you have a child on the way. It's a well-done film with lots of layers to dig into. Make Mine Music is another of the Disney package films of the 1940s. Like Melody Time, it's very music-centric, but with several less narrative pieces. There are definitely some gems here. Peter and the Wolf is a nostalgic favorite of mine, and I love the playfulness between the animators and the animated characters on All the Cats Join In, but there are a lot of segments that are less interesting. There are a handful that are just slow and dreary without a lot of variety to them, and they feel more like music videos than anything else. I admit I do have a strong bias for story-centric film and have trouble getting into something that's mostly just pretty visuals set to music, so if that's something you don't struggle to connect with, this might be a much more engaging series of shorts for you. I do appreciate the varied styles of animation, from quiet and pastoral to loud and cartoony. It's certainly a good showcase of Disney animator talent, it just often leaves me a little bored. The Letter is a Bette Davis film in which she plays a woman who fatally shoots a male friend of hers. She tells her husband and the police that the man came over and drunkenly assaulted her and that she shot him in self-defense, but it soon comes to light that there exists a letter between her and the dead man that may tell a very different story. The first thing I want to bring up about the film is that it has one of the most stunning scores I've ever heard. Max Steiner wrote the music, and I was frequently stunned by how beautiful it was, something I hardly ever notice in movies. Beyond that, this is a pretty satisfying little melodrama. You always have to kind of be willing to lean into Bette Davis's acting style with her overly expressive eyes and breathy delivery of dramatic lines, but once you do, it is pretty rewarding. This one does a good job of unraveling pieces of her character a little at a time and constantly making us question whether or not we're on her side, right up to the end. Solid film, especially if you like the genre or the performers already. Mildred Pierce tells the story of a woman who splits from her husband and, now raising her 2 children alone, sets out to succeed for herself. We hear her story in a flashback interspersed with a mystery where we find out her new husband has been murdered and her ex is the prime suspect. Joan Crawford carries herself here with such an air of determined stability, and whether you like or dislike Mildred as a person, there's always a sense that she's going to find a way to come out ahead. The most interesting character dynamic is definitely between her and her oldest daughter, Vida, who develops a sense of snobbish elitism at a very early age, leaving Mildred constantly playing catch-up to meet her child's expectations. The mystery is fine, but it was watching this relationship that really captivated me throughout the film. It's the only part of Mildred's life that feels out of her control, and without giving too much away, it is what ultimately contributes most to her downfall. This is a solid film, and a good character study of a really fascinating woman. The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad is a Disney film featuring 2 half-hour animated adaptations of classic books, The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. These are pretty straightforward adaptations of these books, although the Wind in the Willows segment chooses the story of Toad's obsession with motor cars to focus on. As Disney's 1940s package films go, this is absolutely the most entertaining and engaging throughout. The stories are classics for a reason and are interesting enough to quickly catch the viewer's interest during their short runtime. But what pushed it above the others for me most decisively was the music. The film contains 2 pretty great songs, one in each segment, that I think could easily hold their own in the Disney song canon were they included more often: The Headless Horseman and Merrily on Our Way. I had maybe heard each of these songs once, but I was really struck by how delightfully they capture the tone of their respective segments. While I haven't fully completed the package films of the decade, this is definitely the only one thus far that I could see myself watching again sometime. The White Tiger tells the story of Balram, an Indian man from a poor village who gets a job as an upper-class family's driver. He devotes himself to the family in the hopes that it will help him further his ambitions, only to find that he will only ever be a servant to them. We know at the start of the film that Balram ends up ultimately wealthy, so we're watching to figure out how he gets there. I had such a great time watching this film. It's funny and dark and sad and intense at all the right moments, and additionally it's one that prompted a ton of thinking for me. The upper-class family here brings to mind stories like Native Son, Knives Out, and to a more extreme extent, Get Out, where people are willing to be charitable and kind to those less privileged than themselves until it becomes inconvenient. I was also struck by the final shot of this movie, more than any final shot I can think of in recent viewing. It lingers just a little too long and ends up communicating a very chilling message. That's a lot of varied, scattered thoughts, but in summation, I really loved this. Saludos Amigos is another of the 1940s Disney package films. Yes, I've been making my way through them. This is the shortest of the bunch, at only 42 minutes, and focuses on 4 countries in South America, with an animated short focusing on some aspect of each of them. It's interspersed with live-action footage of markets, cultural celebrations, and landscapes in the various locations. It's a decently entertaining piece of educational film, but educational film is most definitely what it is. The cartoon gags fit around the facts about each country and their culture, not vice versa, which is kind of a cool thing to do. It's just not what I was expecting from this, and not something I'd sit down to rewatch. Several of the shorts are framed with some words about the cartoonist's perspective. What about this country inspired this kind of story, how character types in one country reminded them of character types in their own, and so on, which gives it a kind of behind-the-scenes feel. It's an interesting one to watch once, but it definitely isn't one that I feel a need to revisit. The Dig is set in England in 1939 and stars Carey Mulligan as a young single mother with mysterious mounds of dirt on her land, and Ray Fiennes as the local museum worker she hires to come excavate them. They soon find something much bigger than expected, and we watch how the discovery affects the lives of everyone involved. This is an unexpectedly artsy film, by which I mean more attention was drawn to the film's cinematic techniques than I'd have expected. There are several scenes where we watch footage of one person while hearing dialogue from an entirely different scene, which gives the movie sort of an odd, dreamy quality, as if we're not ever fully in one place. On the whole, it works, aside from a few scenes that step just a little bit too far into precocious portrayals of childhood. But both leads really turn in tremendous performances, as does Lily James in her smaller side role. The movie didn't amaze me on any level, but it's well acted, well directed, and well written. The map of tiny perfect things treads some familiar ground. It tells the story of a teenage boy stuck in a Groundhog Day type scenario, reliving the same day over and over again. By the time we join the story, he's already lived an unknown amount of time this way, most likely several months, if not a few years, and he's starting to get bored until he meets a teenage girl trapped in the same time loop. This movie dances right along the line of being too cute, too simplistic, too manic pixie dream girl, but it ultimately manages to avoid most of those traps and creates a really charming rom-com and coming-of-age drama. It shifts focus in the final act of the film in a way I really appreciate, which pulls it right out of those manic pixie dream girl tropes for me and sets it back in the real world among real characters. The two actors playing the leads are charming and funny and likable kids. Maybe a little self-absorbed, but never just jerks for no reason. Suspend your disbelief a little bit, and this is a delightful watch. Dodsworth is a wealthy American who retires and decides to take a trip abroad with his younger wife. It becomes clear, however, that she is not ready to think of herself as someone old enough to retire or be a grandparent or any of the things her husband wants to do, and those differences escalate during their trip. This is a difficult movie to figure out what I feel about it. It definitely doesn't go in the direction I expect it to. I'll start with the performances, I suppose. Walter Huston and Ruth Chatterton create some truly memorable characters here. Huston plays Sam Dodsworth as a fascinating combination of adventurous and stuck in his ways, and Chatterton's Fran Dodsworth is never fully unsympathetic, even when she continues to make really terrible decisions. This film may be meant to take a bit more of a hard stance on who was right and who was wrong in the scenario, but I found my sympathies flipping between the two every few scenes. I was mildly surprised by how the story ended, but it was a satisfying ending. This thing isn't amazing, but it's worth a watch. Moxie tells the story of Vivian, a high school girl who, inspired partly by her mom's smash the patriarchy past and partly by the new girl at school, starts an anonymous zine dedicated to encouraging the women of their school to stand up against sexism in the system. Before long, there's a full-on revolution happening. I absolutely loved this. Loved this. It made me laugh, and it made me care about the characters, and it made me cheer, even when the events seem a little idealistic and probably unlikely to happen in real life. I love the depth of characters they build in these teenagers, particularly in Vivian's best friend, who worries that she lacks the courage to follow her friend on this path, and Vivian's boyfriend, who may be one of the most likable romantic lead protagonists I've ever seen on film. I love the clever dialogue, which is funny and interesting without ever seeming too scripted. Sometimes you just want to see good people fighting for the underdog and winning, and that's exactly what this movie offers. This is going to be one I revisit from time to time, for sure. Jimmy the Kid is a family comedy starring Gary Coleman as a precocious rich child who gets kidnapped by a group of amateur criminals who don't really know what they're doing. They might, however, be just what Coleman's character needs to teach him how to be a kid. This movie is pretty goofy. It's clearly aiming toward a very young audience, and is filled with silly slapstick gags and cheap one-liners that frequently don't work, but not always. There are enough jokes in here that even if only a quarter of them land, that's enough to make you feel like you're having an okay time. That's what happened with me anyway. It was hard to get irritated by any of the cringier jokes because they were over pretty quickly. Additionally, I haven't really seen Coleman in anything before this, but his matter-of-fact delivery of some of these lines made them work better than if it had been someone more visibly winking at the camera with their character. I genuinely enjoyed his performance, and it helped to ground the more outlandish acting around him. Not a great movie by any means, but I didn't hate it, and if I'd watched this as a kid, I probably would have loved it a lot more. Mame is a musical version of the story of Auntie Mame, the eccentric and eclectic woman who takes in her orphaned nephew and teaches him to live a colorful life full of adventure. Lucille Ball plays the title character here, and while her singing chops leave much to be desired, she does bring a sense of tremendous warmth to this character, which I haven't always seen in other versions of this story. You truly feel Mame's generosity, which is important for the story's third act, where Mame is hurt that her nephew hasn't embraced the lessons of inclusivity and open-mindedness that she tried so hard to instill in him. The songs are catchy and mostly pretty fun, with some great choreography and some very weird choreography. There's also an odd gap in the story at the end that made me actually wonder if I'd missed a scene. Mame does something outrageous, it blows up, her nephew is furious with her, and then it's suddenly 6 or 7 years later and everything is fine now? It's an anticlimactic way to close out the story, and is honestly just plain confusing, given what we've just been shown. The film definitely has its flaws, but if you like classic musicals, you'll probably enjoy this one. Toys is about a toy factory that has been left to the deceased owner's brother, a military man with zero interest in toys or fun. The owner did have 2 adult children, but deemed them not yet ready to take over the factory. The military man has new ominous plans for how to use the factory to manufacture weapons, and the owner's children have to step up and protect their father's legacy. This is an exceptionally odd movie. There are so many things that I think are meant to be whimsical or fun, but are actually just terrifying. For example, there's a song about happy workers played in the factory early on that I think might be trying to convey like a whistle while you work joviality, but it just creeps me out. The song later gets remixed as a dark electronic version as the new owner takes over, but that one isn't any creepier. I had trouble finding my footing in the film's humor as well. I couldn't quite figure out how much of a man-child Robin Williams was supposed to be, and I couldn't get a handle on Joan Cusack at all, although the final few scenes with her did help. It has some good adventure sequences toward the end, but as a whole, this aesthetic mostly misses me.